queers, I hope that you're doing well. I've decided to kick off Pride Month by being a little bit vulnerable on the internet, which is something that I've deliberately steered myself away from for a while, but this is one of those conversations that I just keep hearing behind closed doors or just between handfuls of people, and I want to turn into a more open conversation and try to offer some solutions perhaps. So here we are. So the conundrum is this. I'm a queer non-binary person. You probably know that. I'm also a disabled person. You definitely know that. And I have a notoriously garbage work-life balance because I really enjoy all the jobs that I do, and they're all in different categories, so I can take a break from one thing by doing another thing. But also most of those jobs are things that I do more or less independently or just via email with other people, so I need to work pretty hard to actively seek out meeting new people. And that's fine. I have my small little group of close friends. I'm more than content with that. I'm a very happy being. But sometimes I do feel a bit alienated from the wider communities that I'm a part of. And so when I decide to venture outside of my work bubble for the occasional night out on the town, I'm always like, I should go to queer spaces. That would be fun. I will meet more people like me. But in case you didn't know, queer spaces almost exclusively translates to queer bars or clubs. And do I like bars or clubs? No, I don't like being in big crowds without personal space. I don't like being touched by strangers. My auditory processing is garbage, so I can't understand what anybody is saying in loud spaces, which makes it really hard to meet people and flirt. I really struggle with moving and flashing lights and can get dizzy and disoriented, which is an issue in those places that have very minimal seating that is almost exclusively used for people making out, which is not something I want to intrude upon to any degree. Absolutely not. And also, I have a lot of strong food sensitivities and I can't drink. So you'll very rarely see me order anything from an establishment, meaning that at the very least I looked left out, and if it's a situation where there's a specific required bar tab or something, which sometimes happens, I will have to purchase something really expensive that I never really give away to my friend. So now I'm out cash I wouldn't have otherwise spent, and I look like the odd one out, and it's a terrible time. And I typically navigate the world pretty easily, able to accommodate my access needs, so I don't think of myself as having access needs. But the last time that I went to a bar, this is a true story, I sat by myself at the table we had commandeered the entire night because I knew that if I got up from it, somebody else would take the only place we had to sit down. And then I watched as everybody else around me danced and got progressively more intoxicated while I was left almost entirely alone for the entire evening, with the exception of the time that somebody came over to ask about the fidget toy that I was using and went, "Aw, are you nervous? It's just a bar. You don't have to be nervous." And then the last time that I went to a club was for a specific show that was adjacently for work, and I was there by myself, and so I brought a book for the pre-show to try to minimize the feeling of alienation and just exist on my own, but ended up having a very hard time focusing on the book because I could feel everybody staring at me, and also the music was way too loud. So that wasn't incredibly effective in fixing the alienated feeling. Also, generally when you see a human reading a book, you don't go ask them about that, so nobody came to say hi. But at the very least, I probably looked less anxious and lonely from the outside, so that's a win. But logically, of course, this is gonna be the case. If I hate bars and clubs, I'm not going to suddenly love them when I'm in one that's full of lesbians, nor am I going to statistically go there and find the kind of people that I would like to spend time with, because most of the people who are in my life don't really enjoy those activities either. So cognitively, I know that the only thing going to those spaces does for me is make me feel like I'm not queer enough, or I'm not a welcome member of my own community, so I don't go to those spaces anymore. And that's fine, but then the question becomes, what are the alternatives? And also, how do I find them? Now, historically, nightlife has always been at the core of queer culture. Jessica Kelgren-Fozard has a video about the connection between queerness and alcohol. I will link above. You should definitely go check it out. But the very short version of the history is that throughout all of history, alcohol has been a very great excuse to engage in exploring gender and sexuality with plausible deniability. And taverns and clubs have always been optimal third spaces for people to go and hang out and potentially get up to some shenanigans, with records of specific places for people like us going back hundreds of years. Nightlife has also been intertwined with debauchery, which queerness has often been seen as, so they naturally paired together. And in the United States, Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, for people who don't live in the US, they made alcohol illegal in the US from 1920 to 1933, and it went not fantastically, but it led to a flourishing of queer nightlife because bars that sold alcohol were equally illegal and subject to police raids, making gay bars comparatively safer than they had been at other times in history because they were no longer the primary target. After the prohibition ended, liquor control boards set up strict regulations around who was able to sell alcohol to whom and could very easily revoke liquor licenses, often making it illegal to sell alcohol to so-called sexual deviants. This is when queer nightlife became a lot more underground. Bars known as bottle clubs, where you would bring your own alcohol, were very common, but so were bars that illegally sold liquor to whomever it wanted and then paid off the police, which is where, of course, the mafia gets involved with queer history, because of course they do. And while it was great to have queer bars where the police were consistently paid off, so raids were fairly unlikely because that meant that queer people could spend time together semi-safely, it's not just the liquor regulations these places weren't abiding by. It was also like health and safety regulations and occupancy limits and like, hey, maybe don't use the fact that you now know somebody in the community is queer as a way to blackmail them out of a lot of money kinds of things, which ultimately is what led to various queer bar protests around the country in the late 60s, with the Stonewall Inn in New York City being one of the most major ones. But even today, where it's much safer in many places in the United States, temporarily, to be queer, this legacy of alcohol-centered queer spaces as the primary hangout locations continues to be the case, and many alcohol brands specifically actually advertise directly to our community. It's also important to note that historically queer spaces have always had issues with inclusion. Many gay bars were specifically for cis white men, often not letting women or people of color into the establishment. So many bars today will specify that they are queer bars, not gay bars, because of this historical distinction. There are also significantly less lesbian bars than there are gay bars, which is a constant issue that we talk about often in the community. There's also an incredibly long legacy of queer and trans communities working to like distance themselves from being seen as mentally ill or otherwise at all connected to the disabled community, despite the fact that for much of history those two things have been tightly interlinked. And every minority community has their, well, I'm in this minority, so I can't be discriminatory against XYZ other minority thing. And racism and ableism are two very big ones in the queer community, which definitely obviously ties into this accessibility issue. And that's really frustrating, given that queer people are more likely to be disabled than the general population. We're also significantly more likely to have severe substance use disorders. So limiting our community spaces to almost exclusively being old, small, crowded buildings that are often either up or down a flight of stairs without elevator access where the primary activity is drinking is a much larger problem than it seems to be on the surface. There's also the question of age. If all of our queer spaces are 21 and over, while up to 40% of unhoused young people identify as LGBTQ+, where are they meant to go? What spaces can they go to? What about the fact that going out to a bar can be very expensive for people, and we're a community that statistically has much lower income than the general population? What about, I don't know, COVID safety, or the fact that Pride events usually have only a handful of accessible restrooms and only one or two accessibly seated spaces along the parade route that usually fill up every year? And also, like, this might be a slight hot take. I'm always happy for accessible sections to exist in spaces. I'm very grateful for Pride events that have them. That's awesome. I'm really grateful for anybody that has an ADA section at any event. But the way that ADA specific spaces and quiet locations of Pride events are set up often like, here, date one of your own kind, just makes me kind of prefer suffering in the larger herd of people because I feel real weird about it. While I take no issue with coloring pages and board games on their own, there is something infantilizing about having all of your social outings planned out very similarly to play dates your mother would organize for you in elementary school. It's as though because I am disabled, I could not possibly want to partake in grown-up activities like going out for drinks or being out past 10 p.m. It's also dismissive to reduce my options to play dates or no dates. This reflects how ableist systems at large desexualize and infantilize the disabled body. Now, when I talk about the issue of inaccessibility in gay clubs, people often suggest that I try like a drag brunch instead, but those are also expensive. I still have food sensitivities and I'm surrounded by alcohol. It's still loud and flashy, and often drag events are more audience interactive, which leaves me as the person who is usually wearing earplugs and not eating anything at a restaurant, feeling very much like I stick out and worrying about potential crowd work or otherwise commentary being directed towards or targeted at me. There's also the reason that you won't find me at comedy shows very often. It's the same situation. So like, that's not really a solution either, but it does fix the sitting down issue, and sometimes these events are ASL interpreted, so that's a plus, that's a little bit better. For other options, if you're able to exercise or you like spectating exercise, the US Gay Sports Network has lots of options for sports leagues in your area for literally all kinds of sports and exercise. I have found that most of the options on there are gay men specific, but not all of them. I know that local to me, there's like a Dyke running club that exists, and I used to be part of a queer femme rock climbing group for a hot minute. Those are very word of mouth, but if you do some searching on Instagram, you can sometimes find those. Pop-up events are also really common in our community because they're cheaper than trying to set up a brick and mortar situation, so keeping an eye out for posters or Instagram ads is really great. Sign up for newsletters so you can know when these things are happening. Often one night a month meetups at bookstores or coffee shops or board game nights at community centers, those kinds of things are going to be your primary sober or more sober community building events available, so follow some local queer organizations online, see what events they post about, and if any of them seem like something you might be into. What else? Oh, Everywhere is Queer is a map of queer-owned businesses and community-serving groups and pop-up events around the world. You can sign up for their newsletter as well. I highly recommend checking them out. Strands for Trans is a map of trans-friendly hair salons. Hair salons and tattoo parlors more generally are often very big queer community places. Obviously there's a service involved in that as well, so like they're not places you can just like go and hang out. And of course there are also all kinds of online community spaces as well, but if you're here you already know that at this point, I'm assuming. But this is one of those things where like theoretically this whole list of options exists outside of bars, but then in practicality that ends up boiling down to very little things. And so it can feel a bit frustrating that even the events more for people like you still aren't quite for people like you, and I just want to make sure that I acknowledge that as well. This small list of solutions does offer options, but there are still far too non-bar options available, and that is incredibly frustrating. But also, if you have the time, energy, and spoons to do so, create your own pop-up event somewhere. Like, could be as simple as a potluck picnic in the park or something like that. People want to create and foster community, so ask your local queer-owned business to host an event and help out. That's totally a thing. That's definitely an option. The other obvious thing I want to point out is that if you're planning a queer event, make sure to include accessibility people on your planning committee. Not just like a disabled person you know, but like accessibility people. And make sure to put that accessibility information in your promotional materials as well. And accessibility, again, is not just about disability. It's also about age groups and cost and location as well. I have a video about creating accessible spaces I will link above if you want to learn more about what options exist and how to do that. There's also a checklist for accessibility I found from Rooted in Rights that I will link below, but I do think that my video is actually more thorough than their checklist is. And like, yeah, inclusion takes a little bit of extra thought, sometimes a little bit of extra money, for sure, but something being hard is not a reason not to do it, especially when that slightly hard thing is going to make a world of difference for the more marginalized members of your population. On a more like personal note, this feeling of complete alienation and detachment from what is supposed to be my own community is something that I've been pondering a lot lately as the political situation in the US has made me feel like we need this community now more than ever, and I'm like, well, I don't feel like I'm allowed to be a part of it. And I've also been more sappy than usual lately about uncovering the forgotten, aka deliberately buried, histories of minority people for some reason. But that made me wonder if, like, perhaps my way into feeling more connected to this community is through expanding my disabled history focus to queer history as well, since for a long period of time they were the same history and are still incredibly intertwined. I've never really had that much interest in learning about those things because I have felt so disconnected from our modern day community that it never quite rang true for me in history books either. But I did venture to the new Stonewall Visitor Center earlier this spring, and for some reason something finally clicked in that space. Probably because it was the first explicitly queer space I've been into in New York City that is ADA compliant. But I bought a few books. I intend to read those books at some point and potentially turn them into something for this channel, so we'll see if that happens and when that happens. I'm gonna let that journey go as it kind of wants to. I've also just been really engaged in the idea of how much history exists in New York City more generally that we just walk past every single day and then never think about or talk about, which sort of ties into that wider exploration I want to do. But anyway, that's all that I have for you today. I know this is a lot shorter, but I didn't really have a lot more to say about it than this. If you have any specific resources or events or places you recommend, please drop them in the comments. Many of the articles that I read for this that are in my source list, which is linked below, were specific to different places around the country and talked about the kinds of queer events that are available in those cities. So do take the time to do a little bit of research and try to find something that is for you, that is near you. My resolution after making this video is to try to get myself to go to at least one of the things that I found. Maybe. We'll see if I follow through on that. But with that, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember that critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.